Welcome everyone. This is a video that I've been looking forward to making for a long time now, as we finally have version 1 of Riverpod.
Can I get a
Or almost. It's currently in a dev release, but I don't expect a lot will change. So hopefully this video does not get too dated too fast. But yeah, with the release of version 1, there is a ton of breaking changes, but breaking changes for the good. It's overall a lot better, and we also have a couple of extra nice things that Riverpod is doing for us, or a couple of nice extra features that have been added. So yeah, if you do want to take a look at this yourself, you can go over to pub.dev. You'll see there's a pre-release at the time of this recording. It might be at latest when you watch this. And yeah, just click the pre-release, and then there's a change log with all of the different changes. And that's essentially what I've done. I've just made my own little list of these changes, and we'll be going through them in this video. And then also taking a look at some past tutorials that I've made regarding Riverpod, and showing you how the code has actually changed with this version 1, what the breaking changes are. And then after looking at the breaking changes, we'll go into more detail with the new features and additional changes that you may need to take note of. Yeah, if you want this document, you'll see that in the Riverpod tutorials GitHub repo that I have, there is a new 005 with the tutorial.md, so it's just a markdown file with a couple of descriptions on what has changed. If you have been following this series, then you will know that in the past we made some examples like counter apps and to-do apps. And if you want to take a look at the changes between what they were and what has happened now that we're using Riverpod version 1, you can see that there's a commit that I highlight here. And this commit literally goes through all of the changes that were necessary to upgrade to Riverpod version 1. Please also note that along with these changes, the code has also been updated to support null safety. So yeah, you can take a look at this in your own time. It's fairly straightforward, and we will be covering that in detail in this video. So with that all said, let's actually jump into it. And before we go into version 1 of Riverpod, I do need to highlight that in version 0.14, there were some breaking changes as well with regards to how you create a state notifier provider. There were additional breaking changes as well, but nothing of relevance to the stuff that I've covered in previous videos. So you are probably already familiar with this, but yeah, with a state notifier provider, where it normally only was that you needed to provide the MyState, or not MyState notifier, but the notifier that you create. Now you need to specify the notifier you create and the state of that state notifier. And then in the actual places that you watch and listen for it, you no longer need to listen to, or you no longer need to watch for the state. You now just watch the actual provider, and this model is the state of the state notifier. And if you want to actually receive the notifier, then you would need to say .notifier in the watch. So yeah, if you didn't know, these are changes that have occurred a couple months ago, and I never covered them in any of my previous videos. We can actually take a practical look at this example. So I'm just going to zoom in here. This is the repository, and as you can see, we have all of the previous tutorials, and they've been updated. So if we look at the source control, this is the commits that I made to update to version 1 and null safety. So if we just inspect this, we can take a look at, for example, in the counter application that I made, there is a state notifier example. So let's just minimize this. And as you can see, we had a counter state notifier, and this was the old code. Now we are just giving the actual state as well. So this counter state is on the counter state notifier. And in the actual builder, you can see that where we used to call .state to listen to the state, we no longer need to do that. And where we call the increment method on the notifier, now you need to say .notifier to get the actual notifier, and then you can call the methods available on them. So this increment if we actually take a look at the code, this is in the notifier. Here you can see the counter state notifier, state of counter, and we have a method called increment. So yeah, with that out of the way, we can actually jump into the changes with Riverpod version 1. Okay, the first breaking change that we will discuss is that scope provider is removed and it's now been replaced with just a provider. So in one of these examples, I think it's actually in the to-do example. So let's open this one. Again, these are just examples. You do not need to actually care about the code. I'm just showing you examples. And yeah, what we care about is, I think it's called current to do or something like that. Yeah, okay, so this current to do, this used to be a, what's it called? A scope provider. And a scope provider is essentially a provider that you will override somewhere in your code. If you are unfamiliar with that, I do recommend watching some of the old videos, as it's a really cool way that you can avoid unnecessary rebuilds in your application. But yeah, all you actually need to know is the fact that in the past this was a scope provider, now it's just a provider. And as you can see, we use it in, or we inject it over here. So here we are just creating a new provider scope. So essentially creating like an isolated state for our providers that injects or like overrides the current to do with a specific to do value. So in this to do item, you can see that here we are reading or watching the value of the current to do. Okay, the next breaking change is that the prototype has changed for the build methods in a consumer widget. So in the past, we would always get a scoped reader in a consumer widget, which we would then give the watch method, and then we would use watch and we'd watch the relevant providers. The difference now is that instead of a scope reader, we get a widget ref. And this widget ref is similar to the ref that we would get in a normal provider. So when we create a provider and we get a provider reference, now the difference is that we can actually call ref.watch and ref.read. So we also no longer use context.read. We use this widget reference in our widget to actually access the states of providers or to call something on a provider. And yeah, if you want to take a look at the examples, you'll see that here we actually get the ref in a stateless or stateful widget, but we'll get to the stateful widgets in a bit. As you can see, we have consumer widgets and we get a widget ref, and then we're using ref.watch. And yeah, if we want to call ref.read, we can do that as well. And we also have something new called ref.listen. So ref.listen we'll get to in a moment. But yeah, the fact that the widget ref is now made accessible to us basically means that we can do a lot more in our widget. Additionally, it also kind of consolidates all of the different ways that you could read a provider, because you may recall I even made a video of all of the different ways that you can read a provider. And the thing is, it actually got to the point where it's actually confusing reading different providers, because sometimes you read it in one way, another time you need to read it in another way, then you need to use context, then you need to use a reference, then you need to use watch as a method. So this kind of just encapsulates everything so that it's more similar, all the different ways that you access providers. Okay, and continuing, you can see that family.overrideProvider now must create a provider. I'm honestly not too sure what the change is here, as I don't recall using this before, but yeah, take note of this. ProviderObserver.didUpdateProvider now receives both the previous and new value. So ProviderObserver is a way that you can observe the states or observe all of the providers as they change state. So the example that's given in the documentation shows how you can create a logger based on like when your providers update. So in this instance, you extend ProviderObserver, you override this method, and then in your main app where you inject provider scope, you can give this observer. So this logger is this observer. The difference now is that update provider gets the new value and the old value. So that's just a nice little change if you want the old value or the previous state of a provider as well. And okay, may have changed is removed on Provider Observer, and mounted is removed. So if you have been using mounted, this is an alternative way that you can now determine if your provider has been mounted or not. So you just create a variable. On the suppose, you set it to false. By default, it's true. So just to check to see if it's mounted or not. Technically, if it's been disposed, means it's no longer mounted, because these providers are only created, I believe, if you actually read them in a widget. So technically, it would be mounted if it exists, as far as I understand. Okay, then provider container debug provider values and debug provider elements are removed. You can now instead use get all provider elements. So if you actually want the elements of the provider. Okay, and that is the breaking changes. Now we can take a look at the deprecated, and it's actually this is quite a big deprecation, and something that people have been asking for a while is provider listeners. In the past, people have asked that instead of having like multiple provider listeners, you can create like a multi-provider listener, something that was similar to the original provider. And if we take a look at an example of this, I'm just going to search for ref.listen. Then you can see that we are using ref.listen to listen to the state of a particular provider, and then depending on like the states of that provider, we can do something on that. So in the past, you had to use ProviderListener, but now instead of using like that widget to listen to providers, you can just use this widget ref that you get, and you call .listen on it. You listen to the provider you want to listen, and then as it changes value, you can like update or do something. Maybe you show a notification message, maybe you set a different state somewhere else, something like that. Essentially, this wouldn't cause your build method to show something else. It will just maybe show, like I said, a notification or something like that. In this example, you can see I'm doing exactly that. I'm listening to the to-do exception provider, which is a provider that gives you an exception, so an error. And then if there is an exception, if the state is a null, then I show a scaffold messenger of context show snack bar. So just show a snack bar with the description of the failure. If you're interested in how this works, you can definitely take a look at the previous videos. But yeah, the amazing thing about all of this is the fact that it's now really easy to actually just have multiple listeners within the same build method. So it gives you a lot more freedom in terms of using these listeners in your code. And I also think it looks cleaner. Okay, I'm just gonna undo this because we don't want this. And then next up is the provider reference is deprecated in favor of provider ref base. Okay, so that is, I think it's because like all of this got consolidated into the provider ref base. So feature provider and stream provider, the widget ref that you get in a normal provider. So this reference over here, I think that is now the provider ref base, but I'm not too sure, to be honest. If you want to, you can read the documentation for that. Okay, so let's get into the new features. Probably what you care about the most. I know I do. So a big thing that's new is the ConsumerStatefulWidget. So we are familiar with what a consumer widget is, but now we have a stateful widget as well. So that's essentially extending a stateful widget to also be a consumer widget. So what do I mean by that? If we take a look at this example, we had a stateful widget and creating a state, and we're knitting state, and I'm creating a text editing controller, and then in the dispose, I'm calling dispose. So basically for the reason of having a text editing controller is like the reason that in this instance I made it a stateful widget, but there may be many reasons you want a stateful widget. Maybe you're doing animations, or maybe you're listening to page navigations, or whatever it may be. But with pre-version 1 of Riverpod, the problem was that you can't then easily get the provider reference, so you couldn't have gotten that watch method on it. Instead, you would have had to return a consumer in your builder, and in the consumer you would have received the watch, and then you can use the watch to listen to the to-dos and whatever else, okay? Well, to listen to providers. The changes now is that we can create this consumer stateful widget. So it's literally just adding consumer to stateful widget, and again adding consumer to the state object as well. And now what we get is this reference over here. So this ref is part of the state class over here, and no matter where we are in the state class, we can use this ref. So as an example, now I can't edit this file. Let's jump to it. As an example, you can say ref.listen here, and you can listen to something. You can say ref.read. Please note though that you can't do watch. Watch should be limited to your builds. But yeah, so instead of doing context.read, you can now just do ref.read and pass in the provider, and do that wherever you are in your stateful widget. And along with that, you get this ref in your build, and yeah, it basically works like a consumer widget. So that's just a nice cleanup, and it definitely gives us a lot of advantages. Okay, and then continuing, all watch functions now support select. So this is really cool. I'm not going to show you an example in code. I think this example is good enough. For example, let's say we have this provider that's a state notified provider, and then it has a object called user. Now we can use select to listen to a specific property on that user object. So here we're listening to user.name, and what this means is that now this username and this builder would only ever be triggered once the name actually changes. So even if the state notifier's entire state gets updated, this will only be triggered if the actual name changes value. So this is a way that we can minimize builds in our application just by listening to the exact property on the model that we want, or on the object that we care about. Yeah, so definitely going to be using a lot of this. Then we have ref.listen. So we saw ref.listen in the builder, where we can listen to a provider, and then as it changes, we can update it. This is along with the deprecation of ProviderListener. But the cool thing is that along with us using it in a builder, we can also now use it in other providers. And that is amazing. So for this, I actually did make an example. So I'm just going to undo all of these examples of everything that I did. And now here, this is a counter application that I made, and I'm just going to run this, and I'll walk you through the code and show you how the ref.listen can be used. Okay, let's close this, and the application is running. And as you can see, there's 3 examples. So a change notifier counter, a state notifier, and a state provider counter. And we only care about the state provider for now, but I mean, you can do this on any provider. So in the state provider, you can see that we have an increment button, and it tells you the value, and it tells you if it's even or not even. And this is the code that we had before. So state provider, and we just update the counter provider at the bottom here. So you can see floating action button, counter provider, we increment the state. And then we have this is even provider that listens to or watches the counter provider. And if the counter provider changes, it does a check to see if the state is even or not, and then returns a Boolean value. So we can actually remove this because there's a method called isEven on integers. And yeah, that will be the same. So then, yeah, this isEven provider is used at the bottom here. So this text that just shows if it's even or not even. And the counter is shown over here. So just the value of the counter, which is watched over here. And yeah, very straightforward. And I would like to challenge you in this to basically try and do this on your own, but after the video. So I'll tell you why. we're going to see how we can do this with a listener. And then I want you to think how you would do this without having a listener, or how complicated it might be to actually do it without a listener. So yeah, I'm just going to uncomment this code, and you can see that this is called even counter. So the idea is that we are counting the number of times that the increment has been incremented to an even value. So what do I mean by that? We are checking to see if the is even provider. So we're listening to this provider, and then what we're listening on is the states of that provider, which is a Boolean, and then we get that value, and then we do a check to see if the value is true, then we get our current reference. So this reference for this provider, we access the state value, and then we increment that value. And by default, or the initial value that we return for this provider is 0, okay? So every time is even provider returns true, then this listener will be triggered, and then we update the states for this. And the important thing to note here is that this listener does not trigger an update in the actual provider. The thing that is updating the provider here is the fact that we are calling ref.state, okay? If we were to remove this, then this listener will not update this provider at all, and this provider will not be rebuilt. So yeah, we do want this in this instance, and I also made a widget over here, ConsumerWidget, that just watches the value of the even counter, and then we display the even counter, and we'll display it here as well. And yeah, do a hot restart, and now you can see that we have this counter at the bottom here, so that will increment every time that it's even, okay? So is even, then it increments to 2. And yeah, so in a similar way, just as an example, we could have obviously also listened to the counter provider, so the actual integer, and we could have done the same check. So if the state of that value, so if the state of this counter provider is even, then we do ref.state increment. The reason that I'm showing you this one as well is because, as you can see, this is a provider, and here we know that it's a bool, so we just set it to a bool, but a state provider is slightly different. A state provider gives you access to a state controller, and the state controller's type is int, and that state controller is the thing that we manage to update the actual state of a state provider. That was a mouthful, a bit complicated, but yeah, so it's just different types that you need to manage, essentially. We'll actually get into the state controller in a bit, because this has also been updated slightly. But yeah, this is the part that I want to challenge you. I want you to take away the listener, and I want you to think of how you would do the even counter without having a listener. So how are you going to use your normal ref.watch, for example, to watch the is even provider to update the value of this counter? And yeah, you'll see it's actually, maybe I'm overthinking it, maybe it's actually easy, but yeah, if you want to challenge yourself, see if you can do that. And then yeah, I'm pretty sure you'll realize or come to see that ref.listen is amazing, and it definitely opens up a lot you can do with providers and like integrating providers together. One example that I can think of is that, let's say in the is even provider, we had a different provider. Okay, so maybe that was like a notifier. So we say ref.read, we say some notifier provider. Okay, this notifier provider doesn't exist, unfortunately. And I don't feel like typing it now. But yeah, because we're reading it like this, we would like to access the notifier. So we access the notifier, and then let's say this notifier had some hypothetical method called refresh. Then we refresh it every time the value is even. Then this can be triggered manual. This is a way that we can trigger this function in an elegant way within our providers. And now that I said that, I actually come to realize that there's actually a better way we could have done the same thing. So as an example, let's say we have a provider and this is some notifier. and we'll say that this is a state notifier provider and that the value is a string for that state notifier provider. And you know, I'm actually going to type it out because it's starting to bug me that we have these warnings. So I'm going to say that this is some notifier and extend state notifier. And the value is a string, and then it needs to be overridden. Okay, and we'll say that the initial state is just empty, and we won't pass in any states. And state notifier provider, the notifier that we will return is some notifier, and the state for that notifier is a string. Okay, so this is how we expose the state notifier provider. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say we're going to create the notifier, so creating some notifier, and here we'll return the notifier, and then finally we'll add some method here called refresh, and maybe we'll I don't know I guess we'll give it something, we'll give it a string value. Then we'll set the state equal to the value. Okay, now what we want to do is we want to set the value of the state notifier every time that the isEven is called, or maybe, I don't know, something like that. So when the even counter changes, okay, this is a really arbitrary, no reason to do it like this. So we're going to say ref.listen, we'll listen to the even counter. The even counter will be a string, so no, the even counter will be an int some line, but we don't need to say it like that. I literally just did it. Okay, ref.listen, we specify the int there. Sorry, I had a little bit of a brain fart. Cool, so we get the value, which is an integer. And now what we're going to do is on the notifier, we will call refresh, and then we will give the value that we get. Okay, so value.toString maybe. And there we go. So if we want to expand this and see that it's working, we'll create a stateless widget and we'll call this notifier test. Maybe we'll call it some notifier test. And we'll return text with the value that we'll get from it. And then ref dot, oh, this needs to be a consumer widget. I probably need to create like snippets for this. And then we get a widget ref, which is the ref, and ref.watch, and then we'll watch the some notifier provider. So the sum notifier, and we'll say that this is the value. Okay, and we'll print the value. I just want to make sure, what is this? Yeah, string. Okay, and then we will use this at the bottom here in our column. And yeah, that should work, I think. Okay, it's not showing. Okay, it's because I was being an idiot and I actually didn't click the thing. So you may have realized that before I did. So yeah, let's say by default this is nothing. And now you'll see that, okay, by default it's nothing. And then once it's even, then we start counting that or changing the value to the thing. So yeah, just a stupid example showing that how you can use it. But yeah, definitely keep this in mind. If you ever create a notifier like this and you want this notifier to respond to a different provider state, then in the actual provider or the state notifier provider we created, you have this listener that updates it in some way when something changes. I can also see that this can be very useful for future providers or something like that. Maybe you're listening for a future provider's value, and only when that future provider completes, for example, then you want to update the states like you would do in this example over here. This example over here. So let's say this was a future provider that you were listening on. The future provider updates, then you change the states. So it's a nice way that you can mix and match providers together, if you get what I'm saying. So that was a long-winded explanation. The next thing that we can talk about is, all providers now receive a custom subclass of provider ref base as a parameter. So this is just that way that everything has been consolidated into stuff, or basically make it more similar in scope, I guess. So it says that allows providers to implement features that is not shared with other providers. And then finally, feature provider, stream providers ref now as a state property. This we explored, so we saw that we can directly mutate the state like this. And a state provider's ref now has a controller property, which allows the provider to access the state controller exposed. So in a state provider, I'm not too sure, I can't think of a scenario where you would like to do this, but you can now access the state controller on a state provider. So as I said, over here, we got access to the state controller, which is the states of a state provider. You can also directly access that controller in your state provider. So you can access the states, you can listen, add listeners, you can check to see if it's mounted. You can get a stream, so a stream of the integers that are being submitted, or stream of the states. So I'm sure there's a good reason that you would like that. I just can't think of one. And then almost at the end, you can now override any provider with any other provider. Okay, so this is a magical one, as long as the value that they expose matches. For example, it's possible to override a stream provider with a provider async value. So as an example, let's actually search for override with, so let's take a look at this example. Here you can see that I'm creating a new provider scope, and then we're overriding the to-do with a new to-do, okay? This is easy because this current to-do is a provider, and we're overriding it with a value in this instance. But what this allows you to do is override a provider with another provider as long as they have the same type. So creating a new stream provider and overriding that with or overriding a current stream provider with another stream provider is a hassle, and it requires you to manage streams and all that. Now it's possible just to override it with a different provider as long as they have the same type. So as you may be familiar, and if you're not familiar, definitely watch episode 3, I believe, of this series, where we discuss async value. Async value is always returned from a stream provider and a future provider, and this is essentially just it gives you access to a union state that has data loading and error states. And the way that we can use this now is we can override it with a provider and just specify that the state that is expected for a stream provider would be the model, but wrapped in an async value. So just an easier way to override providers. And this is especially true for testing, which we'll cover in a future video, how to do testing in Riverpod. And then this will also become way more useful. Okay, then provider container pump, a utility to easily await until providers notify their listeners or are disposed. I still need to see examples of when to use this exactly. I guess this is a way that you can wait for a provider to have submitted a response before you do something. So I'm not too sure. I've not I've also not seen an example of this, so yeah, if you know, please comment down below. And then finally, all providers can now be scoped. And I think what they mean by this is that if you take a look at this provider scope, we are scoping the current to-do. And I believe in the past you could only scope providers like this. Now it's possible to scope a future provider as well. And I believe that's possible because we can now override any provider with any other provider as long as the state that it returns is the same. Okay, and then the last thing are these changes, which I'm going to leave to you if you want to read up on them, what the changes are. Nothing too major, but yeah, this is just me going to be reading what it says over here, so I'll leave that to you. You can pause the video or you can take a look at the markdown file yourself. So yeah, for reference, for this and for the future, if you are interested, you can see that in the Riverpod tutorials, that markdown file is in version 5. And if you do want access to the old videos or the old code for the videos, because I'm not updating the videos for 1, 2, 3, for example, you can always go to the history. So here I made a history pre-version 1, and you can take a look at what the code used to be. So this was before we used Riverpod version 1. This is just for clarity's sake for people that are watching the videos in the future. But yeah, in upcoming releases and stuff, I'm sure Riverpod will continue to change. I'll create these histories to basically mark like breaking changes and stuff that is relevant to the code that we have covered before. Okay, and yeah, that's that for this video. I hope you found it helpful. And as I said, please let me know if I missed something important that should have been covered in this video, or something that I misunderstood. Yeah, I'm really excited about Riverpod 1 and really stoked to see what the future holds for it. I think Remy is working on dev tools for Riverpod. He's mentioned a couple of stuff like that on Twitter. And yeah, definitely give Remy support. If you haven't, you can always buy him a coffee, as I think he definitely deserves a coffee. And as I'm saying this, I realize I've never actually done it, so I'm definitely going to be buying him a coffee. You guys should track me up on that to make sure that I actually did it. You can go to Buy Me Coffee and you'll see that there's messages that you can leave and stuff. So make sure that either me, Gordon Hayes, or at Fun with Flutter or someone left a couple of coffees for me, because he deserves it. Okay, cool guys. I'll catch you in the next video. Until then, cheers.